If everybody can just take a seat, we will start the formalities, if that is all right with everybody. Well, thank you very much for coming here this evening. My name is Tim Wilson and I am Australia's Human Rights Commissioner. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of this land on which we are meeting tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Professor Gillian Triggs. We're honoured that you've come here this evening, as well as Andrew Penfold's mum, who I understand is here, and no doubt beaming with pride for her son and her son's achievements. Of course, there are many people in the room tonight, and we welcome you for coming, but this event is also being live streamed, and I understand also being recorded for APAC, so other people get to enjoy the benefits and fruits of Andrew's thoughts into the future. It is a great pleasure to have Andrew Penfold at the Commission this evening to deliver one of the Commission's periodic rights talks. I'll get straight to the point. I really like Andrew. In human rights, we spend a lot of time talking about issues of law. We see this in debates, of course, around basic protections of human rights and freedoms all the time. But law is only one part of the broad puzzle of how we advance human rights within our community and tackle challenges. Law is normally only the beginning of issues in tackling them. After law, there are the enormous contributions that can be made by civil society and voluntary action to address the challenges we face in human rights and promote a more healthy and inclusive society. And Andrew understands that. He has had to understand that to advance the very important task that he has taken on around advancing the education of Aboriginal Australians. And he has done it voluntarily with the cooperation of others within the business community in the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation. And it does good work. Yesterday I got one of those horrible ice bucket challenges, if everybody knows what that is, and I was asked to either throw a bucket of freezing cold water over my head or donate money to motor neuron disease charity. And I chose the latter because I think, if nothing else, there's the importance of having some degree of dignity in this office, and not tipping a bucket of water over your head is a pretty good way of starting that. But I did choose not to donate to motor neuron disease, and that's not because I don't think their work is important, but I do think that the AIF does excellent work and should be supported perhaps as a preferable charity from my perspective. He has done an enormous amount of good work with the AIF. It has taken individuals and businesses to make a positive approach to addressing the issue around education access for Aboriginal Australians. It also has a long-term focus by pursuing this important objective. If we want to advance the interests of Aboriginal Australians, it requires having empowering tools to make sure that they can be the most successful Australians in every sense of the word. And in advancing issues of social justice and Aboriginal advancement, Andrew has never lost sight of the importance of foundational pillars of our free society. In fact, earlier this year, he rose and contributed to the discussion around free speech in our society, even though it's obviously quite a sensitive issue when it comes to issues around race and racism, and has never lost sight of the importance of tackling these things and how we should do it as part of a liberal democracy. And tonight, that will be much of the subject in which he addresses. And it's a great opportunity to hear from Andrew on these important topics, which will be followed by questions and answers. So who is Andrew Penfold and how did he become such a superstar? He's a former lawyer and investment banker with 20 years experience in the finance industry. He left the corporate sector in 2004 to establish the St Joseph's College Indigenous Fund. The success of this model inspired Andrew to establish a national program in 2007, the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, or the AEST. The AEST provides scholarships which enables Indigenous students in financial need to attend leading Australian schools and universities, as well as mentoring and career support to ensure scholarship students make a successful transition from school or university to productive and fulfilling careers. The AIF has raised almost $90 million, an extraordinary achievement, and offers over 500 scholarships every year. 155 AIF scholarship students have successfully completed Year 12 or university degrees, and I've no doubt that number will continue to rise. Andrew has received, of course, many awards and honours for his incredible work. He was the New South Wales finalist of Australian of the Year in 2010. He was the University of Technology Sydney Chancellor's Award for Excellence in 2013. He was a New South Wales Human Rights Award winner in 2013 and became the Human Rights Ambassador for New South Wales in 2013-14, but I understand you have just lost that post to somebody for 2014-15, but we still welcome very much your contribution here. And you've been appointed a member of the Order of Australia for significant service to the Indigenous community, particularly through the provision of educational programs for students in 2014. Andrew is also a member of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council. Ladies and gentlemen, you did not come here to hear from me, you came to hear from him, and he is Andrew Penfold. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that welcome, and could I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and perhaps just pause for a moment to reflect on why we do that, which is to recognise that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia have been looking after this country and nurturing this land for 40, 50,000 years or more. And obviously it's in great shape. And I think as Australians, we all should be really proud of the fact that we are privileged to share in this Aboriginal culture of Australia that has continued and thrived throughout all that period, and actually is the longest continuing surviving culture in the world. So that's something we should be really proud of. And just a short story on that, I was recently talking to the CEO of a major corporate in Australia who told me that he was recently in France with his 15-year-old son. And he was in an art gallery, and I can't remember the name of it, but I'm sure many of you will know the one, and looked up and saw a lot of Aboriginal art up on the wall, and his 15-year-old son stood back and said, "Gee, Dad, doesn't that make me proud to be an Australian?" And I thought, it just wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. For non-Aboriginal kids to be growing up today, celebrating the fact that this is a culture that they own and they belong to and it's part of their country is something that's a really great thing. And I think we should hopefully see more of that in the future. But I think as we also go into the debate around the constitutional reform and the referendum in Australia, which I'll talk about a little tonight as well, I think it's really worthwhile to remember that, you know, what we're doing is talking about embracing our past and our history as a nation, and, you know, how privileged and fortunate we are to be able to have that 40,000-year culture and history to be part of in our community as well. Also, could I acknowledge President Professor Triggs, and thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for inviting me here tonight as well. And Tim mentioned that I've recently lost my title. I didn't actually lose it. It was a one-year appointment. So I was really honoured to be the recipient of that award for 1 year. And I should just tell you a little bit about that award, because Raoul Wallenberg is a human rights heavyweight of the 20th century who was a Swedish businessman and diplomat, and this New South Wales Human Rights Award was named in his honour. And he is widely celebrated for his successful efforts to rescue tens of thousands of Jews in Nazi-occupied Hungary during the final stages of World War II. While serving as Sweden's special envoy in Budapest between July and December 1944, Wallenberg issued protective passports and sheltered Jews in buildings designated as Swedish territory, saving tens of thousands of lives. And in 2013, as Tim mentioned, the New South Wales government established the New South Wales Human Rights Award in Wallenberg's memory, and it was my great honour to receive that award last year and to become the inaugural Human Rights Ambassador for the last 12 months. I would also congratulate and acknowledge the new recipient of that award, Maha Abdo, who was recently announced a couple of weeks ago. She's the Executive Officer of the Muslim Women's Association and was recognised for her tireless efforts to empower young women and to promote harmony between multicultural communities in New South Wales over the past 25 years. So I congratulate on her and her on that award, and of course wish her all the best for the next 12 months ahead in that role. There are a lot of strong feelings around human rights issues in Australia, and whenever we're talking about this, I think the most important thing that's really critical that each of us can participate in this civil discussion and freely express our opinions. And tonight there's four main themes that I'd like to talk about involving human rights. The first is racism in Australia and how that is an obstacle to the fulfilment of human rights more generally. Also the issue of freedom of speech and how unlimited historical debate can combat racism and help forge a path to strong future and reconciliation more generally. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about Indigenous disadvantage in Australia and why I believe in the power of education to address that. And finally, the vital contribution that civil society and the corporate sector in Australia have in also participating in addressing human rights issues in Australia and around the globe. Racism, of course, is one of the greatest obstacles to social cohesion and with it equal access to human rights. We know that it destroys the confidence, self-esteem and health of individuals and undermines efforts to create fair and inclusive communities, and it breaks down relationships and erodes trust. I don't think you need to experience racism to condemn it, just as you don't need to experience abuse against women to have an opinion on that. But I've also had some limited first-hand experiences of it myself. Obviously, I'm white Anglo-Saxon, so I haven't a direct experience of it, but growing up as a youngster, I ran around the streets here in inner Sydney with a lot of Aboriginal kids, and I saw how their lives were different to mine and how they were treated so differently to me, even when we would go into the same shops and walk into the same train stations and other venues and so on. It was really apparent to me the difference that they faced between the way they were treated and the way I was treated. And secondly, when I met my wife and her families in my teens, I witnessed and heard about racism firsthand. Her mother and grandparents encountered this racism when they came to Australia as refugees after the Second World War. And so growing up and listening to their stories about it, I've been aware of the issues as best someone in my position can be, I think. In many ways, Australia is a different country now, but there is evidence that racist attitudes are becoming more widespread. The latest Scanlon Foundation survey found that 19% of Australians suffered discrimination based on racial or religious prejudice in 2013, which was up 12% in 2012, and the highest level reported since the foundation began conducting those social cohesion surveys in 2007. In Australia, America and the EU recession, austerity and social change have been the common backdrop to this troubling shift in attitudes. Australia's economic downturn does not compare with the impact of the GFC in Europe and the US. But if our unemployment rate here were to rise to similar levels, racism could also become pervasive and ugly in Australia. And history, of course, provides many examples which can help us understand this phenomenon and the focus that can be brought to bear against it. For example, in the US, in the wake of World War I, immigration continued to change the face of major cities at a time of widespread poverty. Racial violence flared in these cities. Dozens of African Americans were lynched each year in the South, and Ku Klux Klan membership peaked at 4.5 million people. However, increased prosperity and wealth distribution in the 1920s, combined with improving education standards, countered racist attitudes. In fits and starts, improvements in the standard of living saw America forge its own long, slow path to reconciliation and the civil rights movement. In Australia today, the tenor of social and civic discourse is also a major cause of concern. Public life here has descended into new levels of maliciousness and intolerance, and in recent years, it's evident in the ad hominem attacks on politicians and their families and the unruly protests that attempt to stifle quite rational debate. We're becoming immersed in a culture of cynical and aggressive individualism, and this is partly what seems to be igniting vicious racial outbursts that can cause serious personal harm. Professor Marcia Langton recently observed that racism is closely connected to the more general but equally serious problem of bullying, and perhaps a coordinated campaign could be launched against both of these pathologies. History has shown that education is instrumental in the fight against racism, and public education campaigns like Racism Stops With Me, launched by the Commission here, are among the more effective ways to tackle racism. I believe education campaigns should also concentrate particularly on schools and be linked with zero tolerance anti-bullying strategies. Just as history helps us to understand the dynamics of racism, it can also be an effective means of countering it. For example, the secondary school curriculum could be altered to teach vital lessons about racism, while also injecting more significance and relevance into Australian history. Compulsory Australian history in Year 10 covers the evils of the white Australia and stolen generation policies of the last century, but the scale of human suffering caused by these is often not conveyed, and to some may even appear comparatively minor compared to contemporary world horrors that occur on a daily basis. For this reason, Australian history should be studied in a broader world context, and no child should leave school without having this knowledge imprinted vividly on their psyches. Only then will they be equipped with the basic social and historical literacy needed to combat racism. Earlier I touched on the stolen generations, and for those who may not be familiar with it, this was the infamous period of Australian history from the early 20th century until the 1970s, where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in state or religious institutions where they were denied their culture and language to be assimilated into white Australia. The policy of forced removal devastated Indigenous families with ongoing consequences for Indigenous communities across the country. In the 1980s, the unrestricted work of historians, journalists and artists was instrumental in raising awareness of the stolen generations and its terrible consequences. The revelations about stolen generations ultimately led to a Royal Commission in the 1990s and a formal apology from the Prime Minister on behalf of the nation in 2008, an event seen by many Australians as the proudest, most significant and powerful act of reconciliation in our generation so far. The pathway to the national apology was far from smooth, and the facts uncovered about this shameful chapter of our nation's history have been the subject of intense debate over the past 2 decades. A focus of those debates has been whether the forced removal of stolen generations and other government policy in Australia should be recognised as cultural genocide. There is credible evidence of deliberate official policy of wiping out Aboriginal culture by assimilating the younger generation into the Australian population, where they would eventually become bred out. Some historians also argue that the many frontier massacres of Indigenous people by farmers and police were officially sanctioned and had genocidal overtones. Of course, there are some commentators who decry this as the negative black armband view of Australia, and emphasise that Australia's history is one, on the whole, a source of great pride, which it is. But many consider this to be an offensive apologist view, but the freedom its proponents have to express this view is critical. For example, could you imagine the national outrage if anyone tried to pass laws banning us from saying that the stolen generations ever took place? Or if it was illegal to say that past practices and policies amounted to cultural genocide, however offensive that might be to some. History has shown us that suppressing free speech and using the law to fetter historical inquiry often plays into the hands of racists who peddle myths and lies, drumming up publicity and sympathy for their grubby agendas. Of course, the Nazis knew this and exploited the courts as a powerful platform for proclaiming their racist hatred when charged under anti-vilification laws in 1920s Germany. More recently, discredited historian and notorious Holocaust denier David Irving is a case in point. In 1996, Irving filed a libel suit against historian Deborah Lipstadt, who had accused him of deliberately distorting and denying the facts about the Holocaust in several books. Irving's already tarnished reputation was comprehensively trashed when he lost that case, with the judge finding that he had, for his own ideological reasons, persistently and deliberately misrepresented and manipulated historical evidence. 3 courts found for Lipstadt, concluding that Irving's writing were deluded and a product of his anti-Semitic bigotry. Shortly thereafter, Irving and his views faded from public view, but in 2006, Irving was restored to the spotlight when he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment in Austria for remarks he made in a speech to an audience in Vienna in 1989. This case received widespread media coverage and had the unintended consequence of making a martyr out of Irving and his cause for the cause of free speech. Deborah Lipstadt, the historian Irving had sought to bully and intimidate with the libel suit, which ultimately discredited him, said of the case, and I quote, "I'm not happy when censorship wins. And I don't believe in winning battles via censorship. The way of fighting the Holocaust in eyes is with history and with the truth. History reveals parallels and patterns that are crucial of our understanding of ourselves and one another. So unearthing the fullest possible truth of tragic events such as the stolen generations is critical. The positive consequences of unlimited historical debate about Indigenous issues in this country are clear. After centuries of silence, constant media coverage, and I would say particularly in the Australian, has made the issue of Indigenous inequality in Australia a mainstream issue. Our Prime Minister has gone so far as to name himself the Prime Minister for Indigenous Affairs, staking his leadership on the government's ability to address this crisis in this area. I think you'd all agree that would be inconceivable just 10 years ago. But no matter how unpalatable the truth may be, historians have a duty to attempt to uncover it, and as the example of the stolen generation shows, acknowledging the truth of the past is how we begin to change the future. As the philosopher George Satayana once said, those who ignore the past may be doomed to repeat it. And in the field of human rights, truth is the most powerful weapon, and acknowledging the truth is how we begin our journey of reconciliation. But more than truth is needed to complete this journey and to ensure all Australians are empowered to access human rights, which leads me to Indigenous education. I strongly believe that those of us privileged to be living comfortably in stable and secure societies have a duty to assist the billions who are not, and to speak up about racism, oppression and other injustices inflicting humanity. The alternative is every man for themselves, and that's not our way. Australia is rightly called the lucky country. We benefit from isolation, natural riches, a stable democratic system and the undisputed rule of law. We have a clear responsibility to help so many living in poverty and fear in the undeveloped world. But we don't need to look beyond our borders to find these nightmarish scenarios. Not all Australians are lucky. As I speak, tens of thousands of Indigenous Australians are living in a state of degradation, which would be an outrage and disgrace in any country, but especially in a land as rich as ours. Today, Indigenous Australians are much more likely to be unemployed or suffering financial stress than non-Indigenous Australians. Indigenous households earn around half the average weekly income of non-Indigenous households, and Indigenous men and women have a life expectancy around 10 years lower than their non-Indigenous counterparts. In 2013, when the Year 12 attainment rate for non-Indigenous Australians was 82%, only 55% of Indigenous Australians completed their secondary schooling. In very remote communities, only 24% of Indigenous kids finish Year 12 at secondary school. The low rate of Year 12 completion among Indigenous Australians is directly related to many aspects of the shameful disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Only 38% of Indigenous Australians who leave school before Year 10 have a job. In contrast, 75% of Indigenous Australians with the Year 12 qualification are employed. Indigenous Australians who are fully engaged in study or employment are more likely to be in good health, less likely to smoke, use drugs or alcohol, and to have been a victim of violence or to have been arrested in the last 5 years. The facts bear out the universally accepted wisdom that education is the key to tackling disadvantage in all aspects of our community. There is no disputing the fact that education is the essential basic key in opening the door of opportunity, and it has been the core ingredient in human progress, no matter what race, colour or creed, throughout the entire human history. But this door has been closed for too long, for too many Indigenous Australians because of isolation, lack of facilities, community problems and economic disadvantage. There's a big focus on getting kids to school to lift attendance at the moment, and of course that's a really important part, but it's only part of the challenge, even though it's extremely important. We need to work hard to lift attendance rates, but we also need to make sure we have a range of other strategies to lift educational attainment. This includes engaging with Indigenous parents to understand their views and addressing issues in housing, health, community safety, employment, professional development and teacher development and collaboration, strong school leadership with high expectations, making schools welcoming and relevant to Indigenous kids, and implementing tailored teaching and learning to address the individual needs of each student, and of course the list goes on. Many Australians live in remote communities, and delivering quality teaching to these communities has proven difficult. We need to overcome this difficulty so that every Australian has access to a quality education and that they attend school, because school attendance is a fundamental precursor to both literacy and numeracy outcomes and school completion. Turning these statistics around could take years, even decades. And in the meantime, thousands of Indigenous children are missing out, and it's obvious to me and to many others that we need to take urgent action right now. 10 years ago, as Tim mentioned, I learned about the great work of Sydney's St Joseph's College in Indigenous education, and after hearing about what they were doing, I was so inspired by what they were doing that I quit my job and spent the next 5 years setting up a foundation to raise money to create a sustainable long-term program from that. So it's now raised about $8 million and it's been supported by many corporates and leading individuals around the country to develop a sustainable program for that. But more importantly, the model was achieving real results for dozens of Indigenous students. So in 2007-2008, we decided to scale it to create the national program of the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation. And as Tim mentioned, 5 years on, we've raised $90 million in partnership with the federal government and the private sector, and we now offer around 500 scholarships a year at leading schools and universities around the country. And what we're most proud of there is not the dollars and the numbers, but the actual outcomes of the students, because this is why we do it. In 2013, we achieved a retention in Year 12 completion rate of 93%, which is not only the highest rate ever reported by AIF, but is also the highest recorded of any program in Australia. And whilst that's impressive, it isn't just about finishing school. We also support scholarship students to make a transition from school to further studies, employment and university for a productive and fulfilling career. And today, 95% of our alumni are productively engaged in work and opportunity and other pursuits. Our students are becoming doctors and lawyers, nurses, engineers, teachers, mechanics, builders, social workers, artists and business people. And some have even set their sights on becoming the nation's first Indigenous Prime Minister. Despite the facts, there's a small minority who criticise this and mischievously assert that scholarships programs like AIF are taking children away from their Indigenous communities and cultures and repeating the crimes inflicted on stolen generations. To compare this policy with Indigenous kids going to world-class schools today is at best uninformed and at worst an insult to members of the stolen generations. And it's simply racist to suggest that Indigenous children don't belong in some of the best schools Australia has to offer. We don't believe our scholarships are for everyone, nor do we actively seek Indigenous students to take them up. Nor do we pretend that our program is the panacea for the challenges in Indigenous education. We simply open doors to leading schools for Indigenous students who want to access them. In each case, the initiative comes from the students, their families and their communities. Last year, we set out to raise a total of $140 million to help educate 7,000 Indigenous students by 2028. And if we reach that goal, we'll have empowered a legion of young Indigenous people to pursue successful, satisfying lives and become leaders and role models in communities right across Australia. And 7,000 Indigenous, educated, empowered Indigenous men and women could be a game changer for Indigenous advancement and human rights in Australia more generally. Finally, I just would like to talk about the role of civil society and corporations in human rights. And I think AIF is a powerful example of the vital contributions civil society organisations can make to the cause of human rights in Australia. And the success of our model gives light to the belief that corporate profitability and empowered communities are incompatible. By backing the work of the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, companies like BHP Billiton, Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, News Corp, Leighton, BP, Swire, CLSA, HSBC are creating value for their companies while empowering thousands of Indigenous children to build a brighter future through quality education and careers. For these companies, harmonising business strategies with corporate social responsibility makes good business sense. The Australian Employment Covenant, which is guaranteed to provide 50,000 jobs for Indigenous Australians, is another example of a corporate sector initiative promoting human rights of Indigenous Australians, in particular the right to work. And Andrew Forrest's latest project, the Global Freedom Network, inaugurated at the Vatican recently, brings together the Catholic, Anglican and Sunni Islamic faiths in a combined effort to stop modern slavery, and that's another step in the right direction. As we know, governments don't always have the answers. According to a recent federal government report into Indigenous programs, for the past 40 years, and now I quote, strong policy commitments and large investments of government funding have too often produced outcomes which have been disappointing at best and appalling at worst. That's the government's own report. And I believe this sorry history of wastage and failure is a direct result of an overly focus on process and inputs and activities rather than outcomes, and also prioritising ideology over evidence and reluctance to focus on cost-effective initiatives to see what's working and to scale them. In dealing with any social challenge, I think the greatest mistake humanity can make is to do nothing because we can't do everything. There is no doubt that the issues surrounding Indigenous inequality are daunting and complex, but we cannot take that as an excuse to do nothing, or even worse, to continue to focus on process and activity instead of outcomes. Because ineffective government does a lot more than just waste our valuable tax dollars. It makes it harder to achieve real progress because it turns public sentiment into defeat and surrender mode. The public give up and feel a sense of hopelessness when it comes to addressing some of the most urgent national priorities in our country. For example, in 2013, a news poll survey found that 60% of Australians believe there is no solution to Indigenous disadvantage. It's vital that we challenge that in cities' perception that nothing works in the fight against Indigenous inequality before they become self-fulfilling. I'm heartened by the focus of community safety, education and employment from the government, and an emphasis on supporting effective, cost-efficient and scalable organisation with proven results. So while there's still a long way to go, I think Australia is coming to terms with its unjust treatment of Indigenous people and is pursuing a largely bipartisan policy of both symbolic and practical reconciliation. While bipartisan support for symbolic and practical reconciliation is important, reconciliation is not something handed down by governments. It's a two-way process between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The process is driven by people empowered by education who understand their human rights, who are free to debate the issues and demand transformative change. In 1967, Australians voted to change the Constitution to finally count Indigenous people as Australians after a decade-long campaign. In 1992, the High Court overturned the absurd principle on which all land title in Australia was based, terra nullius, in its landmark ruling in Mabo versus Queensland, the culmination of a 10-year battle by Eddie Mabo. And thanks to the Recognise campaign, we'll soon have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to advance reconciliation even further by recognising first Australians in our Constitution. Meanwhile, Indigenous people and communities, governments and civic society must remain focused on improving community safety and closing the shameful gap in education and employment outcomes, issues which serve to diminish the human rights of Indigenous Australians and all Australians. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for that wonderful address. I'm sure there are people buzzing with questions, if anybody has one, to put their hand up and we'll bring the microphone to you. And we do have people ready and raring to go, so if you're prepared, gentlemen here, if you could say your name and then ask your question.
My name is Chandran. I always call myself as an ordinary Australian, and which is what I am. Now, thank you for your wonderful talk. My question is to ask you about the recent review of Australian history curriculum committee set up by our government. And from what we read, the sort of agenda is to emphasize more on the Judeo-Christian tradition, i.e. de-emphasize the Aboriginal tradition. Now, do you feel that is a regressive step? And it's a kind of history wars. So what advice would you, if you were asked, give the government on matters like this? Thank you.
So unfortunately, I think the debates around curriculum too often fall into the sort of ideology camp, and whatever you say, you sort of get this polarising approach to it. The fundamentals for me are that Australia was and always will be an Aboriginal country. And as I said at the outset, you know, this land has been inhabited by Indigenous Australians for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And the sooner we all embrace and recognise that, then the stronger I think we all become as a country, and the prouder we become as a country by having the privilege of being part of a community with that culture and that heritage. I think in terms of involvement of Aboriginal perspectives in the curriculum, I think it's essential, as I mentioned during my talk, that we do involve and include Aboriginal perspectives across the spectrum, particularly in the historical context. As I mentioned, there's very little in the curriculum that goes really to the heart of some of the most challenging experiences we've had in Australia with the stolen generations and white Australia policy and the consequences of those. And it's only through educating children to be aware of those, so that as they leave school, they have this firmly imprinted in their minds and in their hearts. I think we'll ever really achieve anything in that sense. So I think we should warmly embrace it. I also think the issue of bilingual education is really important for Aboriginal people. It is quite offensive, I think, to sort of march in here after 200 years and say that the language you've been speaking for 40,000 years doesn't actually have any significance in our community and our society. I mean, all of our children could probably benefit from learning Aboriginal languages. And as someone mentioned to me recently, you know, a white child in Sydney is just as likely to speak Yolngu language in their life as they are to speak German on their holidays overseas. And Noel Pearson spoke about this on the Q&A that was filmed in Garmo recently up in Arnhem Land about, you know, wouldn't it be great for non-Indigenous kids to also have the opportunity to learn those languages. So I think the sooner we embrace the language, the culture, the history and the heritage into our community more broadly, but through education, particularly in the curriculum, and involving Aboriginal perspectives in all subjects, you know, where relevant. I note, you know, Warren Mundine had some thoughts about where, you know, Aboriginal perspectives might or might not fit in mathematics, for example, and so on. So I think, you know, where relevant and sensible, I think there's a really strong case for including that in all subjects. But most importantly, about educating non-Indigenous kids as well about the horrors of racism and the historical context and consequences they can have.
I'll just say that there is a talk in University of Western Sydney on astronomy, Aboriginal astronomy. That's clear-cut mathematics.
Yeah,
this week.
Exactly.
Just this week, yes. Yes.
Of course, and so that's a great example.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Lee. What do you make of the Team Australia by our captain, Mr. Abbas? So I think it's going to be more of a division than just a team. And now, the issue, they're trying to recruit people from the Muslim community to work for them. Why must something, every time something happens somewhere there in the Middle East, we're always going to panic. We could George Bush in the past to say either with us or against us. And now, I want to go back about this younger group by ISIS in Britain and Australia and the United States. Didn't you think, because we have left the gap wide open, not reaching those young people, not to get to our team before too late and be joining the fight in the Middle East? Thank you. What do you make of it?
Thanks. So a couple of things there. I think the you know, the issue of what's happening in Syria and the current laws in Australia and so on, I think we need to call out evil and atrocity where we see it, and that doesn't have a colour or a religion or a race. You know, that's I think there's too much of a tendency for particularly some sections of the community and commentary to you know, sort of try to drum up hysteria around particular races or religions and so on, and I think that's really unhelpful. These are not issues about race or religion, or I mean, of course they've got some of those issues at their core, but I think we need to speak out about evil and atrocity and terrorism and violations of human rights, whatever sort of context they've got. I think my own view on the Team Australia idea is that everyone seems to make of that whatever suits their ideology and their politics. You know, on the one hand, we're talking about how do we have a cohesive multicultural society and community where everyone is united through diversity and through different backgrounds and cultures and so on. And, you know, that's one way that I would interpret that. Of course, if it's used in a divisive way against particular sections of community, then that's unhelpful and shouldn't be done.
And I think that's the purpose by this government. And it's going to be a more division than get the community.
Question back here.
Hello, I'm Diana. You spoke earlier about truth and history rather than censorship. It just reminded me that just this morning in The Economist, I read about an academic study that had been published in the Journal of Cognitive Science about how children respond to different stories. And you can just read the one sentence. It said the children exposed to religion were not only more willing to accept supernatural stories in religious context, but they were more willing to believe during fictional narratives. It just gave me a little bit of a concern there that we're trying to get people to recognise history and truth without a prison for belief or ideology. And it just worried me. So it's more of a comment. I don't know if you've not seen that study.
I haven't seen it, but I guess my reaction to it is it's a little bit like when people say that Indigenous kids shouldn't go to boarding school. And my view was always that I think it would be the height of hypocrisy and paternalism that we always kind of rail against for someone to tell another mother or father how they should educate their kid and how they should raise their child. So, you know, I think the decision of whether a child is educated in a religious school or a non-religious school is a question for the family, and you know, to raise their child according to their own beliefs. I think, you know, there's plenty of kids who get educated in religion and in Catholic schools and other religious schools that have very progressive and liberal views on human rights and historical debate. And there are those who don't. I don't think it's a religious issue in my view, but I'd be interested to read the article.
Thank you. I was just wondering whether or not there's any capacity, or if you already do this, into looking at what the reception is to the students who do attend those schools by the other students, and whether the other students find it useful.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, many years ago in 2006, Ray Martin did a television story on the program at St Joseph's College, and he interviewed the headmaster there. And the headmaster, he was getting asked about Curly Beale, who's, for those of you who don't follow rugby, a very famous rugby player in the Australian Wallabies, who went to St Joseph's College. And the question was, you know, Curly's got a great deal out of this. How does the school deal with it? And the headmaster said, you know, we've got much more from Curly than we've given him. And what he meant by that is that when a school embraces Aboriginal culture in the school and welcomes Aboriginal people in the school and creates a welcoming environment, the benefits for the non-Aboriginal kid are enormous as well. And I see this every day in the schools we visit, where non-Indigenous kids are learning about Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous history and culture. Of course, you know, there's no better way to break down racism and stereotypes than your best mate being an Aboriginal kid that you play sport with and go to school with and study with and spend weekends with, and all of those sorts of things. And lived experience is always a very powerful way to sort of remove stereotypes and break that down. And also, I think, you know, the fact that a young 15-year-old boy could stand in an art gallery in France and be proud to be from Australia because he sees Aboriginal art on the wall is really a testament to that. You know, that kid goes to a school where there's a lot of Aboriginal boys, and you know, he is in a school where they celebrate NAIDOC Week and Reconciliation Week and have assemblies and culture in their classes, and they teach Aboriginal history and studies in their classes and so on. And this is exactly the brand of reconciliation that I think is the most powerful. And you know, when it starts with the children, then we've got a really bright future. The only comment, just while we're doing that, I also just sort of made me think earlier that I probably should have mentioned is that I didn't give myself a Human Rights Ambassador label. I've just kind of done the work I do because I'm passionate about helping Indigenous kids and helping Indigenous kids to have a brighter future for themselves to benefit all of us. And through that work, others have kind of given me the Human Rights Ambassador Award and so on, but it wasn't something I applied for or nominated for either.
That wasn't a question. There's a question over there, John.
I'm Tom Draglock, not actually Andrew's uncle. This is a Dorothy Fixer situation. As much as I've got concerns, and some of them were expressed by you earlier, about 18C and this propensity to kind of inhibit free speech, particularly in terms of creating a culture of political correctness, which it's already in excess of. I still have major worries, though, about the effect of excessive license, free speech license on children. Like adults, I think, can generally take care of themselves. Most adults are robust enough to be able to handle offence or even insult, as long as it's not absolutely over the top. But I'm very concerned about the fact that children recently have been shown to be shockingly affected by, particularly online bullying, some of which would be racist, I'm sure, and it's driven little children to suicide. Now, this kind of thing, to me, is way beyond the pale. I'm just wondering whether you think there's anything that should or could be done about that in terms of controlling Facebook, Google, or whatever, taking off, offline some of the comments that are made or shutting down certain, I'm not sure about websites, it's more sort of social media commentary that links the problem.
I think looking at the cause, I always strongly believe that the way to tackle these sorts of things is through education. And so the idea of education campaigns like the one Racism Assaulted Me that I mentioned, I think is really important, and similar campaigns bringing that historical context into schools and making sure kids of all race, religion, creed and so on are educated about the horrors of racism and how some of these racist attitudes have been the direct contributors to some of the most grave atrocities in human history. I think, certainly there should be mechanisms, and there are, I think, for removing really offensive and vitriolic bullying and racism from social media. I think those mechanisms are there, but they could be probably strengthened. I think the idea of shutting down things, I think the genie's out of the bottle. Trying to contain information in this day and age with all the YouTubes and Facebooks and Twitters and Instagram and everything else just would be extremely difficult, I think. I think education is the way to approach it.
Gillian, did you have a question?
Thank you very much. First, I just want to congratulate you, I think, for your remarkable work. And as somebody involved when I was in Sydney Law School with a number of students who came from St Joseph's, who then went on to do law and became leaders, and one of them will be a Prime Minister one day, I'm sure of that. So I'm convinced that your approach to this problem, better integration and understanding of Indigenous culture and rights within Australia is absolutely the way to go. But I did want to perhaps make a little comment. One is, you might be very interested, of course, that Malcolm Turnbull, as the Minister of Communication, is looking at establishing an e-safety commissioner to consider this problem of bullying through social media. But it does raise the very issue that the gentleman has raised, and that is it an appropriate thing? How far does this go to restrict freedom of speech without having have a chilling effect? Or is it something we really need to do to protect children? And I don't think we've really resolved that, but I understand that the Minister is intending to appoint a commissioner on that issue. But what I just wanted very briefly to ask you about, because I think it worries a lot of Australians, certainly worries me, is that over the years, as you said, a great deal of money has been spent with a lot of goodwill by governments, particularly the Commonwealth government, but it's seen to have gone to waste. And you said that is because it's been so process-driven rather than really on the basis of outcomes. I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit more of an understanding of where this goes wrong.
Well, I think it goes wrong by having too many middlemen. In some moments, really question whether government is ever going to be able to address this issue. It's failed for 40 years, and whether that's because of entrenched special interest groups and power blocks and other issues inherent in democracy and so on, and other priorities. I just think there's very little evidence of government really making significant change and significant inroads into this issue. Interestingly, I think almost every Prime Minister in my lifetime has said after leaving office that they regret not doing more in this space, and yet when they're there, we see very little action. I think the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, has declared himself as Prime Minister for Indigenous Australia and Indigenous Affairs. I think it's sort of nowhere to hide on that now. I mean, he'll be judged by what happens under his tenure. And I think that's a good step to make yourself accountable in that way. But essentially the problem is that there's just too much money. Sorry, first of all, there's too many programs being developed by governments and by bureaucrats who think they know best and they think they know what the people should have. And in many cases, those programs are not informed by evidence or reality of what happens on the ground. There's far too little involvement by the people who this funding is supposed to be helping. They actually have very little input into the solutions and strategies and programs that have been funded to address some of the issues. So I think, you know, too much imposed from above, too little involvement from below, where we do see from the community. Where we do see involvement, it's sort of under the brand of consultation, which is, in most of my experience, kind of lip service and fairly hollow, and that doesn't help either. And then I think also there's the inherent in any government bureaucracy. I'm not criticising individual people who work in government departments, but the inherent nature of a government department is risk averse, and it's how can we make sure that we've done absolutely everything possible to ensure that we can't be blamed or criticised if something goes wrong. And so often programs are set up and structured based on other considerations like that rather than the outcomes. I think where I've been encouraged more recently is the government has recently, in the Indigenous Affairs portfolio, looked at 150 programs that have kind of grown up over the years in all sorts of departments in the Indigenous portfolio, which haven't been driven by evidence or results or outcomes, and a lot of money gets spent on bureaucrats and so on. And now they're streamlining that into 5 areas, and the focus of these new areas is around funding programs based on evidence and results, and have funding tied to results. I think that's a really good step in the right direction. Of course, it's much easier to say than to do, because there's a lot of will that will be needed, and it's tough for any organisation or program to take funding away from it and to divert it to something which might be more effective and so on, and getting better outcomes. That's always going to be challenging. I think getting the mentality of federal government and state government departments into that line of thinking about outcomes-based programs, not funding inputs and activities and processes, is also going to be really important. So I think it's kind of moving in the right direction in terms of the language that's being used and the restructuring of the portfolio. There's $4.8 billion under these new 5 streams that will be funded over the next 4 years by the government. That's a really good step in the right direction. I think ultimately it will be judged on what outcomes is it achieving, and are we really getting that focus. But also, and this goes back to what I was talking about during my thing, I think when we look at the reason I think government business has got such an important role to play is their thought leadership and the people and capability they have, and the skills and resources of their people. But also, if you look at the way a business or the private sector addresses the problem, is they define success. What do we want to achieve, and they build a strategy and a plan and a budget and everything designed around that, and then they put their best people on it, and they have measurable targets and check-ins and evaluations and everything to make sure that's on track. Governments just historically use some of that language, but it's just not really the way they act in their DNA, whereas in a corporate environment it comes much more naturally to them. So I think, I often would give the example when you're looking at some of the challenges of remote housing in the Northern Territory, and millions and millions of dollars being spent with hardly any houses coming from it. And I just sort of thought, imagine if you just gave the money to Wald King and said, Leighton, go off and build us some houses. You'd have the houses there now, and they would be there for a cheap cost and so on. So it's just that the private sector can be much more innovative, creative, flexible, make quick decisions, show leadership and be innovative and focus on outcomes and results rather than the input. So I think we're moving in the direction of the narrative, and the restructuring of the portfolio is the right one, but the evidence will be interesting to see. Thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a fantastic address tonight by Andrew Penfold, but Before giving my official thanks to him, I can't resist the temptation to address part of the question that was raised here around children and bullying. And I think when we talk about issues like free speech, it's very easy to confuse things like bullying and harassment as free speech. There is a limit to our basic rights, and of course kids in particular fall victim not just online but offline to bullying and harassment, and that has never been considered an acceptable use of people's speech, and there are limits for that. The question is how you go about it, and of course a lot of websites and social media platforms already have their own policies in place to deal with it, but of course it's very difficult to deal with when it's on one-on-one relationships between individuals, for instance through mobile phones or through social media platforms that may just involve direct engagement without a public dimension to it. So it's something we all need to be mindful of. But Andrew, thank you so much for coming here tonight to come and speak to us about all of the 4 subject matters you addressed. And while you talked very much about the challenges that are being faced, particularly in our regional communities, I think one of the things we can always get distracted by is the negative stories in our regional communities and how the issues that are seen as problems. Last week, with my Commission colleague, Commissioner Mick Gooder, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, we were up in Kimberley looking at communities and what they're doing successfully to address their challenges. And the great news is there are so many good stories, and those good stories come from local communities making decisions about their future and deciding how they want their future to appear. And so if you go to One Arm Point, they're being very enterprising with their local businesses and with their natural resources to create a sustainable community. If you go to places like Halls Creek and Fitzroy Crossing, they are of course facing challenges around alcohol and alcohol consumption abuse and the flow-on consequences. But those communities are taking charge of those important issues. But that doesn't mean we don't have an enormous contribution to make as well for those of us outside of those communities. And through the AIF and through your leadership, you have consistently demonstrated an enormous contribution that can be made by average Australians to advance the interests of those of us who are less fortunate and in remote communities. So thank you for coming and speaking with us tonight, answering questions on some pretty varied topics as well. And as a token of our appreciation, we have a small gift to say thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much.